She was the nurse nobody noticed. Quiet shoes. Quiet voice. A face people forgot the moment they turned away. For 6 years, that was the point. Nobody knew that behind the tired eyes and the plain gray cardigan was a woman who had once carried men twice her size out of burning wreckage. Nobody knew her hands, the ones that now changed 4 bags and charted vitals in the fluorescent hum of Ashford General, had once steadied under mortar fire. She had a different name back then, a name she buried the day she came home. Tonight, that name was about to walk through the emergency room doors. A gurney would burst through in less than an hour, wheels screaming against tile, and on it would be a man muttering a call sign only 3 living people were supposed to remember. Everything she had built, the invisibility, the silence, the small careful life, was about to come apart. Before we go further, welcome to Silent Heroes. If you're watching this tonight, drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from, and take a guess. What do you think her old call sign was? Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this one goes. Now back to the story. Her name, the one on her badge, was Elaine Voss. 34 years old. 5'5". A thin white scar above her left eyebrow that she told people came from a bicycle accident as a kid. It hadn't. She kept her sleeves down year-round, even in July, even when the Ashford summer turned the break room into an oven. Under the left sleeve, along her forearm, there was a tattoo she'd tried 3 times to have removed and 3 times stopped halfway through, unable to explain to the technician why she suddenly needed to leave. She had learned the fastest way to survive was to make herself small. Small meant safe. Small meant nobody asked questions. Small meant she could clock in, do 12 hours of triage and charting and quiet competence, and clock out into a life that belonged to no one but her. Ashford General wasn't a place people chose. It was a place people ended up. Underfunded, understaffed, held together by nurses like Elaine who never called in sick and doctors who mostly just wanted their names on the door. The ER smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. The waiting room chairs were bolted down. Somewhere down the hall, a vending machine had been broken for 4 months and nobody had bothered to fix it. Dr. Marcus Feld ran the department the way he ran everything, like it existed to make him look good. He was tall in a way that seemed engineered for hospital hallways, always positioned so the light caught his jaw at the right angle for whichever family member happened to be watching. He had a habit, a favorite one, of humiliating staff in front of patients when something went even slightly wrong. His signature line, delivered with a thin smile, "This isn't the field, Voss. Try to keep up with the rest of us." He said it to her often. He didn't know how close the joke sat to the truth. Feld's ambition ran deeper than his competence. Everyone on the floor knew it, even if nobody said it aloud. He wanted a directorship. He wanted his name on grant applications and hospital newsletters. He wanted, more than anything, to never be caught being wrong. Elaine kept her head down, kept her voice low. Let him have his moment, every time, because arguing meant attention, and attention was the one thing she couldn't afford. Only one person on the floor ever seemed to notice something didn't add up. Ruth Callahan was 71. A retired schoolteacher who came in twice a week for dialysis, and she had a way of studying Elaine like she was reading a chapter she'd already guessed the ending to. "You don't walk like a nurse," Ruth told her once, low, just between them, while Elaine adjusted her foreline. "You walk like somebody who's used to watching doors." Elaine had laughed it off, told her she was imagining things, but her hands had gone still for half a second, and Ruth had seen that too. "Whatever you're hiding," Ruth said quietly, patting her wrist, "I hope one day you don't have to." Elaine never forgot that sentence. She thought about it on slow nights, on the drive home, in the moments right before sleep when the old memories tried to climb back in. She thought about it now, at 9:47 p.m., as she restocked gauze in Bay 6 and the overhead lights buzzed their tired hospital hum. She didn't know yet that in 13 minutes, sirens would tear down Ashford Boulevard. She didn't know a man would be wheeled through those doors with blood soaking through a field dressing that had been tied with a knot only certain people were ever trained to tie. She didn't know he would open his eyes, find hers across the trauma bay, and say a single word that would end 6 years of hiding in one breath. For now, she just kept working. Small, quiet, invisible. It wouldn't last. At 9:52 p.m., the doors of Ashford General blew open. Not swung. Blew. Hard enough to bang against the rubber stoppers, hard enough that a woman in the waiting room dropped her coffee. Trauma incoming. Male, mid-30s, GSW to the abdomen, BP dropping. The EMTs came through at a dead run, gurney wheels screaming, one of them pressing both hands into a soaked dressing at the man's side. Blood had already pooled dark against the white sheet. Multiple gunshot wounds, possible internal bleeding, we lost a pulse twice in transit, the lead paramedic shouted. The ER exploded into motion. Nurses peeling off from their stations, a tech grabbing the crash cart, someone yelling for O negative. Dr. Feld arrived a beat too late, straightening his coat like he'd been summoned from somewhere important. "I've got this," he announced, loud enough for the family members clustered near the doors to hear. "Everybody, stations. Let's move." He grabbed the chart from the paramedic's hand without reading it. "BP's crashing," the tech called. 80 over 40 and dropping. "Start a fluid bolus, wide open," Feld ordered. "We need to stabilize before we can even think about surgery." Elaine was already at the bedside before he finished the sentence. Her eyes moved over the wound, the color of the man's lips, the rhythm of his breathing, too fast, too shallow, one side of his chest barely moving at all. Something cold settled into her stomach. This wasn't just blood loss. This was worse. "Wait." Her voice came out flatter than she meant it to. "He's got tracheal deviation. Listen to his breath sounds. Right side's diminished." Feld didn't look up. "I'm handling the abdomen, Voss. Try to keep up with the rest of us. It's a tension pneumothorax." Her hands were already moving, checking pulse, checking pupils, running through the sequence her body remembered even when her mind tried to forget it. "If we don't decompress that chest in the next 2 minutes, his heart's going to stop from the pressure alone. The bleeding isn't the thing that kills him first." "I said I've got this." Sats are dropping. 88. 84. The monitor's rhythm blared louder, faster, a mechanical scream keeping pace with the man's failing body. Feld hesitated. It was only a second, but Elaine had spent her whole first life learning to read hesitation, and she knew exactly what it meant. He didn't know what to do next. He was choosing, in real time, between admitting it and pretending otherwise. He chose pretending. "Get me an X-ray first," he snapped. "I'm not decompressing a chest on a guess." There wasn't time for an X-ray. There wasn't time for anything except what came next. That was when the man on the gurney opened his eyes. They were glassy, unfocused, dragged halfway back from unconsciousness by pure animal will. His hand shot up, weak but urgent, and caught Elaine's wrist. "Hawk," he rasped. The word hit the room like a detonation. Nobody else understood it. To the techs, to Feld, to the family members watching through the glass, it was just a wounded man's delirious mumbling. But Elaine went rigid, every muscle in her body locking at once, because that word had been hers. Only hers. A call sign given to her 9 years ago by a unit that had sworn, all of them, never to say it outside a debrief tent. Only 3 people alive were supposed to know it, and one of them was bleeding out in front of her. What did he say? Feld's head snapped toward her. "Do you know this patient?" Elaine's mouth had gone dry. For one terrible second, 6 years of careful invisibility hung in the balance, and every instinct she'd built told her to deflect, to lie, to say she'd misheard. "I don't know him," she said. It came out steadier than she felt. "Then why did you just turn white as a sheet?" Feld's voice sharpened, sensing an opening, a chance to redirect blame away from his own hesitation. "Voss, if you're withholding information about a patient. His right lung is collapsing, Elaine said, cutting through him, "and if you don't let me act right now, none of the rest of this is going to matter." The monitor screamed a new alarm. Oxygen at 79%. The man's lips had gone the color of ash. Feld froze, actually froze, chart still in his hand, the confident mask slipping just enough for the nurses around him to see the panic underneath. Elaine didn't wait for permission this time. Her hands had stopped shaking. She hadn't even noticed them shaking before, the way they always did lately, the way they'd shaken for 6 quiet years. But now, in this moment, they were perfectly, terribly still. 14-gauge needle, she said. Now. A tech, wide-eyed, slapped it into her palm without question. She found the landmark by feel. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The same spot she'd found it a dozen times before, in places with far worse lighting than this. Her spine had straightened without her deciding to straighten it. Her voice had dropped into something clipped and sure, a register nobody in that ER had ever heard from her. "Everybody clear his left side," she said. "This is going to hiss. That's supposed to happen." Feld opened his mouth to object. He didn't get the chance. The needle went in at a clean, practiced angle, and the room heard it before they understood it. A sharp hiss of trapped air escaping under pressure, air that had been building in the man's chest cavity and crushing his heart and lungs from the inside out. "That's the air release," Elaine said, not looking up. "Tension pneumothorax happens when air gets trapped between the lung and the chest wall and has nowhere to go. Every breath makes the pressure worse, until it pushes on the heart hard enough to stop it. Decompressing it isn't optional. It's the only thing that buys us time." The monitor's alarm eased. Not silent, but no longer screaming. Sats climbing. 82. 86. The tech's voice cracked with disbelief. 89. BP's coming up too, someone called from the foot of the bed. 94/60. Elaine kept 2 fingers pressed to the man's pulse point, counting under her breath, her eyes flicking between his face and the monitor with a rhythm that looked less like nursing and more like triage on a battlefield, because that was exactly what it was. "We still need that chest tube," she said. "And he needs blood now, not after imaging. Somebody get me a Cook catheter kit and call up to the OR. Tell them we've got a penetrating abdominal trauma with a decompressed pneumo, unstable, incoming." Nobody moved to argue with her. Nobody moved at all for a full second, because the woman giving orders wasn't the Elaine Voss they thought they knew. Her voice had none of its usual quiet. Her hands didn't hesitate. She looked, for the first time any of them could remember, entirely, coldly certain. Feld found his voice last. "I am still running this trauma, Voss." "Then run it," she said, without looking at him. "Get the OR on the phone." It wasn't defiance exactly. It was something worse for him. It was competence, delivered flatly, in front of witnesses, at the exact moment his own had failed. A nurse named Priya, barely 2 years out of school, grabbed the chest tube kit and set it on the tray beside Elaine without being asked twice. "Talk me through it," she said, quiet, urgent. "I've only done this on a mannequin." 5th intercostal space, anterior axillary line, Elaine said, already prepping the site. "Blunt dissection, not a scalpel stab. You go in with your finger first to make sure you're in the right plane and there's no adhesion. You'll feel the lung when you're close. Then the tube goes in, angled up toward the apex, and you connect it to suction immediately." Her hands moved as she spoke, each step landing exactly where she said it would, and Priya watched with the particular, stunned attention of someone realizing she was standing next to a teacher she hadn't known she had. The wounded man's eyes had drifted half shut again, his breathing easier now, less like something clawing its way out of him. "Stay with me," Elaine said to him, low, just for him. "You did the hard part already. You made it here." His fingers twitched against the sheet, like he was trying to say something else. She leaned closer. "Hawk," he said again, barely audible. You're supposed to be." "Not anymore," she said, and something in her voice cracked, just slightly, Just enough that Priya heard it and filed it away without understanding it yet. Feld had gone quiet, watching from the foot of the bed with his jaw tight, his chart forgotten at his side. The family members outside the glass had stopped talking. Even the vitals monitor seemed to have settled into something almost peaceful, the frantic beeping smoothing into a steady, survivable rhythm. BP's holding at 102/68, the tech reported. Sats 94 and climbing. Get him up to the oar, Elaine said. Now, while he's stable enough to move. The gurney was already turning toward the double doors when Feld finally spoke again, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite accusation. How, he said, did you know to do that? The whole trauma bay seemed to hold its breath waiting for her answer. Elaine straightened, peeled off her bloodied gloves one finger at a time, and for a moment, just a moment, the tired, invisible nurse from Bay 6 was nowhere in the room. In her place stood someone else. Someone with a spine like a rod and eyes that had clearly, at some point, looked at far worse than a chest bay in a mid-sized hospital ER. Training, she said simply. What training? Feld pressed, sensing, perhaps for the first time, that there was a story here bigger than the one he was used to controlling. Voss, that man called you by a name. He called you Hawk. Nurses don't have call signs. The room was silent except for the fading beep of the monitor being wheeled away down the hall. I need to go check on him post-op, Elaine said, and walked past Feld without another word, leaving the question hanging in the sterile air behind her. A question that, in less than 24 hours, an entire courtroom would be asking too. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the story had already traveled the length of the hospital. Nurses who hadn't even been on shift the night before knew some version of it. A wounded man, a strange word, Elaine Voss suddenly cool and commanding in a way nobody had ever seen. By the time the day shift clocked in, the whispers had grown legs of their own, each retelling adding a little more myth to what had actually happened in Trauma Bay 2. Elaine had slept 4 hours in the on-call room and woken to a summons from administration. She found Dr. Feld already in the conference room when she arrived, seated beside the hospital's chief administrator, a heavy-set man named Halloran who dealt with conflict the way most people dealt with a fire alarm, by looking for the fastest way to make it stop. Sit down, Elaine, Halloran said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. She sat. She already knew, from the careful way Feld avoided her eyes, that whatever came next had been decided before she walked in. There's a concern, Halloran began, about scope of practice. About a nurse performing an emergency chest decompression without a physician's direct order. The physician wasn't giving one, Elaine said evenly. The patient had 2 minutes, maybe less. That's not really the point, Feld cut in, and there it was. The same posture, the same practiced certainty he wore in front of families in the ER. The point is procedure. Protocol exists for a reason, Voss. You don't get to decide you're the exception. I decided the patient mattered more than protocol, she said. He's alive because of it. Halloran held up a hand before it could escalate further. There's also, he said, choosing his words with visible care, the matter of the patient's statement. He referred to you by a name. Some kind of code name. Dr. Feld tells me you refuse to explain it. It wasn't relevant to his care. It's relevant to this hospital, Feld said, leaning forward, and for the first time Elaine heard something underneath his usual arrogance. Not concern for the patient, not concern for protocol, but something closer to fear. Fear of being outshined. Fear of a truth he couldn't control. You've been hiding something this whole time. I want to know what. You want to know what, Elaine repeated quietly, or you want an excuse. The room went very still. Halloran cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable being caught between the two of them. Given the circumstances, he said, and given the seriousness of an unauthorized procedure, however successful, I'm going to have to suspend you pending review. Effective immediately. He's still in recovery, Elaine said. If something goes wrong post-op. That's not your concern anymore, Feld said, and there was a flicker of satisfaction in his voice that he didn't bother to hide. Elaine looked at him for a long moment. 6 years of small. 6 years of quiet. 6 years of letting men like Feld take the credit, take the room, take the last word, because attention was dangerous and safety meant invisibility. She thought of Ruth Callahan's voice in her ear. Whatever you're hiding, I hope one day you don't have to. No, Elaine said. Halloran blinked. Excuse me. No. She stood up. I am just done hiding. She walked out of the conference room before either of them could stop her, and instead of turning toward the staff exit, she turned toward the recovery wing. Word had already spread by the time she reached it. A small crowd had gathered outside the recovery bay, off-duty nurses, a couple of day-shift techs, even a janitor leaning on his cart in the hallway, all of them drawn by the same current of rumor that had swept the building since midnight. Priya was there too, arms crossed, chewing her lip. They suspended you, Priya said, disbelief edging her voice. After what you did. I know, Elaine said. That's insane. You saved his life. I broke a rule doing it. You broke a rule that would have let him die, Priya snapped, loud enough that a few heads turned. That's not the same thing. Behind them, through the recovery bay's window, Elaine could see the wounded man, pale, tubes running from his arm, but breathing steady, breathing on his own. His eyes were open. When he saw her through the glass, something in his face changed. Recognition, relief, and something else, a question he clearly intended to ask the second he had the strength. Ruth Callahan appeared at the edge of the small crowd, wheeling her 4-pole with the stubborn determination of a woman who'd checked herself out of dialysis early to see what all the commotion was about. Told you, Ruth said, coming to stand beside Elaine, voice pitched low enough for just the two of them. Didn't walk like a nurse. Elaine almost laughed. It came out closer to a breath than a sound. They suspended me, she said. I heard. Ruth's hand found hers, papery and warm. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong, sweetheart. Means somebody's scared of what you did right. Down the hallway, Halloran and Feld emerged from the conference room, already deep in some quiet, tense conversation, Feld's hands moving in short, defensive gestures. A security guard hovered near the nurses' station, clearly under instruction to make sure Elaine left the floor. She didn't leave. She stood at the recovery bay window instead, watching the man breathe, watching the numbers hold steady on the monitor, and waited, for what, she didn't fully know yet. She would find out in less than an hour, when the elevator doors at the end of the hall opened, and 3 people in dress uniforms stepped out asking for her by a name the hospital had never heard. The elevator chimed at 7:40 a.m. Elaine heard it before she saw it, the particular, unhurried cadence of boots on hospital tile, a rhythm too disciplined to belong to anyone who worked there. She turned, and the small crowd outside the recovery bay turned with her. 3 people stepped off the elevator. A woman in her 50s led them, silver-haired, spine like a plumb line, the kind of posture that couldn't be faked no matter how long a person tried. Dress blues. Ribbons across her chest that even the janitor recognized enough to straighten up when she passed. Behind her walked 2 more, a younger officer and a man in a plain suit who moved like he'd spent more years in the field than behind a desk. We're looking for the attending nurse from last night's trauma, the woman said, her voice carrying easily down the corridor without needing to be raised. A Ms. Voss. Feld, still standing near the conference room with Halloran, straightened instinctively, the way people did around uniforms even when they didn't understand yet what the uniforms meant. I'm Dr. Feld, he said, stepping forward, already reaching to take charge of whatever this was. I'm the attending physician. Can I ask what this is regarding? The silver-haired officer didn't look at him. Her eyes had already found Elaine, standing at the recovery bay window, and something in her face softened before it sharpened again into formality. Sergeant, the officer said. The single word landed the way the wounded man's word had landed the night before, a detonation, small and total. Elaine felt every eye in the hallway shift to her. "Colonel," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was recognition, and something that might have been grief, folded into one syllable. "It's been a long time, Hawk." Feld's mouth opened. "I'm sorry, Colonel? Sergeant? Somebody needs to explain to me exactly what is happening in my hospital." The colonel finally turned to him, and there was nothing warm in it. "Your hospital," she said, "currently employs a decorated combat medic who saved the life of one of my former operators last night using a field procedure most trauma surgeons wouldn't attempt without backup. I'd think you'd be thanking her, not standing between her and the patient. She performed a needle decompression on a man with a collapsing lung," the colonel said, cutting through him without raising her voice, "which is precisely the procedure she was trained, certified, and repeatedly deployed to perform under considerably worse conditions than a fully stocked emergency room. I've read the incident report your administrator emailed my office an hour ago. I'll be happy to walk you through her service record if you'd like context." Halloran, standing a step behind Feld, had gone very pale. "Her service record?" "Staff Sergeant Elaine Voss," the colonel said, and something in her posture shifted, straightened further, like she was standing at attention for an audience that deserved it even if they didn't yet understand why. "Combat medic, attached to a special operations surgical team. 2 tours. A Bronze Star with Valor device for a night extraction under fire that most of the men in her unit are alive today because of. A Purple Heart she never mentions. And a call sign, Hawk, earned because she could find a pulse in the dark faster than the rest of us could find our own hands." The hallway had gone completely silent. Priya's mouth hung open. Ruth Callahan, leaning on her fore-pole, wore the quiet, satisfied expression of a woman who'd known something all along and was finally getting to watch everyone else catch up. 6 years ago, the colonel continued, she requested a quiet discharge and asked that her record not follow her. We honored that. Until last night, when one of my former operators, a man she personally carried 2 miles through hostile terrain 9 years ago, came into your ER bleeding out and set her name into a room full of strangers. Feld's face had drained of color entirely. I didn't know." "No," the colonel said. "You didn't. You suspended her instead." The word landed like a verdict. Halloran flinched visibly. "That suspension," Feld started, "was a procedural matter, not a—" "It was cowardice," the colonel said, flat and final, dressed up as procedure. "I've seen the pattern before. A man who can't stand being outperformed finds a rule to hide behind." Feld opened his mouth again, and this time nothing came out at all. His hands, usually so certain, so practiced at commanding a room, hung uselessly at his sides. For the first time since Elaine had known him, he looked small. "Sergeant Voss," the colonel said, turning back to Elaine, her voice gentling by degrees, "I owe you an apology I should have delivered years ago. We let you disappear because you asked us to. I should have checked on you sooner." Elaine's throat tightened. "I asked to disappear because I didn't know how to stop being her," she said quietly, nodding faintly toward the recovery bay glass, toward the memory of every mission that lived behind it. "I thought if I just got small enough, it would stop following me." "Did it work?" the colonel asked, not unkindly. Elaine looked at the wounded man through the glass, awake now, watching the hallway with tired, grateful eyes. She looked at Ruth, at Priya, at the small crowd of people who, 12 hours ago, hadn't known her at all and now looked at her like they were seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. "No," Elaine admitted. "It never worked. It just made me tired." The colonel almost smiled. "Then maybe it's time to stop." Behind them, Feld had backed toward the conference room, his composure finally, completely gone, muttering something to Halloran about paperwork, about context, about needing to review the incident from the beginning. Nobody was listening to him anymore. The suspension, everyone in that hallway already understood without being told, was not going to stand. Halloran recovered his voice first. There's clearly been a misunderstanding, he said, stepping forward with the strained smile of a man trying to salvage something already lost. Colonel, I assure you, the hospital takes this matter seriously. We'll review the suspension immediately, reinstate Ms. Voss with full. I'd suggest you review more than the suspension, the man in the plain suit said. He hadn't spoken until now, and his voice carried the flat, unhurried weight of someone used to being listened to the first time. My name is Agent Whitfield, Department of Defense, Inspector General's office. I'm not here about the medical incident. The hallway, which had only just begun to exhale, tightened again. I don't understand, Halloran said. The patient you treated last night, Whitfield said, was Master Sergeant Daniel Reyes. He was shot during an operation connected to an active federal investigation, one that, as it turns out, intersects with this hospital. Feld, still hovering near the conference room door like a man who couldn't decide whether leaving would look worse than staying, went very still. Ashford General, Whitfield continued, has received substantial funding over the past 18 months for a clinical trial program. Experimental trauma protocols. Federal grant money, administered through the Department of Defense, intended to study battlefield-adjacent treatment techniques in civilian emergency settings. That trial's been a great success, Feld said quickly, too quickly, the old reflex of taking credit rising up out of pure habit even now. I've been the lead physician on it since. You've been the lead physician on paper, Whitfield said, and something in his tone made Feld's mouth snap shut. We've spent the last 4 months looking at discrepancies in that program's reporting. Patients enrolled without documented consent. Outcomes reported to the funding board that don't match hospital record. And a rather significant gap between the money allocated for trauma equipment upgrades and the equipment that's actually on this floor. Elaine felt something cold settle in her chest, a different kind of cold than the one from the trauma bay the night before. She thought of the broken vending machine, the understaffed floor, the ancient monitors that lagged half a second behind real vitals, the way Feld always seemed to have a new watch, a new car in the parking garage, while the department around him quietly crumbled. That's absurd, Feld said, but his voice had lost its usual polish. I would never. We pulled banking records this week, Dr. Feld, Whitfield said. A shell account tied to a private medical consulting firm. Payments that line up, almost to the dollar, with gaps in the trial's equipment budget. We were building the case slowly. Last night accelerated things. A federal patient bleeding out in an ER that was supposed to have advanced trauma capability funded specifically for cases like his, and instead, the physician in charge nearly let him die because he was too busy protecting his own authority to recognize a collapsing lung. The silence that followed was total. Even Ruth Callahan had stopped smiling. You falsified outcomes, the colonel said slowly, looking at Feld now with something far colder than the professional disdain she'd shown him minutes earlier, to keep federal money flowing into a program you were quietly gutting for yourself. And when a nurse with real field experience saved a man's life doing the job you were being paid to do, you suspended her to cover your own failure. I want a lawyer, Feld said, his voice cracking on the last word. You'll have every opportunity to speak with one, Whitfield said, and nodded toward the 2 uniformed security personnel who had appeared, unnoticed, at the end of the hallway sometime during the conversation. Hospital security, Elaine realized, but flanked now by a federal escort that made the distinction irrelevant. Dr. Feld, I need you to come with us. This is insane, Feld said, backing a step, his eyes darting toward Halloran as if his boss could somehow undo what was happening. Halloran, tell them. I want an internal audit, Halloran said instead, his voice suddenly very small, of everything that's touched this man's signature in the past 2 years. Feld's last line came out as barely more than a whisper, the practiced authority gone entirely from his voice, replaced by something raw and cornered. I built this program. Nobody else was going to. Nobody in that hallway found it worth answering. The security officers stepped forward. Feld didn't resist. He seemed, in that moment, to fold entirely, the tall, commanding posture that had filled hospital hallways for years collapsing into something smaller than the just a nurse he'd spent so long belittling. As they led him toward the elevator, he passed close enough to Elaine that he had to look at her, if only for a second. "You could have just told me," he said, quiet, bitter, "who you were." "You never asked," Elaine said. "You only ever told me who I wasn't allowed to be." The elevator doors closed on his silence. Down the hall, through the recovery bay glass, Master Sergeant Daniel Reyes had pulled himself up slightly against his pillows, watching the whole scene unfold with the tired, satisfied ghost of a smile. The same man whose single whispered word, less than 12 hours ago, had begun tearing the whole careful structure of Elaine's hidden life apart. It wasn't over. Not yet. Whitfield's investigation had barely started, and somewhere in that unraveling web of falsified records and shell accounts, there would be more names, more consequences, and one more danger neither Elaine nor anyone in that hallway could see coming yet. But for the first time in 6 years, Elaine Voss stood in a hospital hallway and let people see exactly who she was. And it felt, after everything, less like exposure. It felt like breathing. The reinstatement came fast. Official within the hour, Halloran practically tripping over himself to have it processed before Whitfield's team finished walking out the front doors. But paperwork wasn't what occupied Elaine that afternoon. It was the question nobody had answered yet. How deep did it go? She found out 3 days later, when Whitfield asked her to sit in on an interview she hadn't expected to be part of. "You're the one who caught the pneumothorax before anyone else in that room," he said, sliding a folder across the small conference table in the borrowed office the investigation had claimed on the 3rd floor. "I need someone who understands the medical side of this. Not the finance side. The medical side." Inside the folder were photocopies, trial enrollment forms, patient charts, equipment invoices. Elaine paged through them slowly, and the deeper she went, the colder the feeling in her chest became. "These consent forms," she said, tapping one. "Half of these signatures don't match the handwriting on the rest of the chart. We noticed that too. And this," she pulled another sheet, an equipment manifest listing advanced trauma kits, portable ultrasound units, rapid infusers. "None of this is on the floor. I've worked that ER for 2 years. We don't have rapid infusers. We don't have portable ultrasound. I would know." According to the federal grant reports, Whitfield said, Ashford General received full funding for all of it. 11 months ago. Then where did it go? Whitfield turned his laptop toward her. A spreadsheet, rows of transactions, a shell company called Meridian Clinical Partners LLC. Feld's consulting company. Formed 19 months ago. Filed as an equipment procurement middleman for the trial. He'd approve the purchase, invoice the grant at full retail cost, then quietly buy the actual equipment secondhand, or sometimes not buy it at all, and pocket the difference. "That's not a paperwork crime," Elaine said quietly. "That's people dying because the equipment that was supposed to save them was never in the building." "That's the case we're building," Whitfield said. "But it's bigger than equipment. Sergeant Reyes wasn't shot in a random incident. He was working an investigation into arms diversion linked to a private security contractor. One that, as of this morning, we've confirmed also has financial ties to Meridian Clinical Partners. Feld wasn't just skimming federal grant money. He was laundering payments through a fake medical trial for people who very much did not want Reyes' investigation to keep moving forward. The pieces settled into place with a weight that made Elaine's stomach turn. "Reyes wasn't shot by accident," she said slowly. "He was shot because of what he knew. And he ended up, of all the hospitals in the state, in the one hospital connected to the people who wanted him silenced. We think it wasn't a coincidence," Whitfield said. "We think Feld knew Reyes was coming, or close to it, and was told to make sure he didn't survive long enough to talk." "He didn't do anything to stop it," Elaine said. "He nearly killed him doing nothing." Which means, Whitfield said, closing the laptop, the people behind Meridian Clinical Partners now know their contact failed. And they know exactly which nurse stopped that failure from becoming a body. The words landed with a slow, physical dread. You think they'll come after me? I think, Whitfield said carefully, you should stay somewhere other than your apartment tonight. She didn't listen. Not fully. She went home anyway, because 6 years of training told her that running from a threat before you understood its shape was how you got caught by it, not how you avoided it. She checked her locks. She checked the fire escape. She sat in the dark of her small apartment with her old service pistol, the one she'd kept locked in a case in the closet for 6 years and never once taken out, resting unloaded on the table beside her while she waited to see if Whitfield's warning had been paranoia or premonition. It was premonition. At 11:40 p.m., the power in her building went out. Not the whole block. She noted that immediately, the streetlights outside still glowing steady through her window, just her building. A deliberate cut. She was moving before she fully registered deciding to move, sliding off the couch, pistol in hand, back against the wall beside her apartment door. Old instincts, buried but never gone, rising up through 6 years of quiet like something that had only ever been sleeping. A soft scrape came from the hallway. A lock being worked, patient and careful, by someone who'd done it before. Her phone was in her other hand, already dialing, already sending Rhea's name and Whitfield's warning into a single frantic thought. The door handle turned, and Elaine Voss, Staff Sergeant Elaine Hawk Voss, stopped being a nurse who used to be someone else, and became, for the second time in 1 week, exactly who she had spent 6 years trying not to be. The door opened 3 inches before the chain caught. A gloved hand appeared in the gap, working the chain with quick, practiced fingers. Elaine didn't wait to see the rest of him. She drove her shoulder into the door hard, slamming it against his wrist, and heard a sharp grunt of pain from the hallway. Federal agents are already on their way, she said, voice low and level, the words coming out in the same clipped cadence she'd used over Rhea's bleeding body 4 nights ago. This building has cameras. You're already caught. Walk away now. There was a pause. A calculation happening on the other side of the door. Then a second sound, heavier, deliberate, a shoulder against the door itself, testing the chain's strength. Elaine didn't stay to test it with him. She backed away, phone pressed to her ear, Whitfield's voice sharp and urgent on the line. Stay on with me, units 4 minutes out, get to a defensible position, while she moved through her apartment with the quiet, economical motion of someone who'd cleared far worse spaces than a 1-bedroom walk-up. The chain gave way behind her. She didn't run for the front. She went for the fire escape, the way she'd checked and rechecked earlier that night without fully admitting to herself why, and she was 3 rungs down the ladder when a second man rounded the corner of the alley below, cutting off her exit before it began. 2 of them. Not amateurs. She could see that in how they moved, spread just wide enough to box her in without crowding each other's angles. You should have stayed retired, the one behind her said, stepping out onto the fire escape landing above. I did stay retired, Elaine said, not turning around, eyes on the one below, gauging distance, gauging cover, the same rapid mental math she'd run 100 times in places far from Ashford. You're the ones who didn't let it stay that way. Sirens rose in the distance, still too far. The man above lunged. Elaine dropped low instead of back, using the narrow landing against him, sweeping his balance out from under him with a move that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with 9 years of training she'd never fully let herself forget. He hit the metal grating hard enough to rattle the whole fire escape. The one below started up the ladder. She didn't have a clean shot, didn't want one in a residential alley with witnesses starting to peer through their windows at the commotion. Old training, still holding, even now. Minimize collateral, control the space, don't escalate past what the moment requires. Instead she kicked the ladder's release bolt, the same maintenance mechanism she'd noted, filed away, and forgotten she'd noted the very first week she moved in. The lower half of the fire escape ladder dropped away with a metallic shriek, folding down and sending the second man sprawling into the alley below. Red and blue light finally washed across the brick. Federal agents. Hands where I can see them. It was over in under 90 seconds after that. Whitfield's team moving fast and clean, the two men cuffed and searched before either fully regained their footing. Elaine sat on the fire escape landing, breathing hard, adrenaline draining out of her in slow, uneven waves, and let herself, for just a moment, feel exactly as shaken as she actually was. Whitfield climbed up to join her a few minutes later, radio crackling at his shoulder. "You okay?" "I'm okay," Elaine said, and found, somewhat to her surprise, that it was true. "They're talking already," Whitfield said. "Not much but enough. Confirmed contract, confirmed employer, a security firm with links straight back to Meridian. Feld wasn't just skimming money. He tipped them off the second Reyes came through those ER doors talking. Told them exactly which nurse had recognized his condition too fast, asked too many questions. He tried to have me killed," Elaine said slowly, the facts settling into her chest with a strange, heavy stillness, "because I saved a man's life." "He tried to have you killed," Whitfield corrected gently, "because you saved a man's life correctly, in front of witnesses, in a way that made it impossible for him to keep pretending he was in control." Below, in the alley, one of the men was being loaded into a federal vehicle, and Elaine caught a flash of memory she hadn't let herself think about in years. A night 9 years ago, a different alley, a different kind of danger, and a young medic who had promised herself that if she ever made it home, she would never again let herself be put in a position where these were the stakes. She'd broken that promise the moment she chose the patient over her own safety. She realized, sitting there on the cold metal landing with sirens still washing red and blue across the brick, that she wasn't sorry. Somewhere across town, in a hospital bed he shouldn't have survived to occupy, Daniel Reyes was sleeping soundly for the first time in days, alive because a woman who called herself small had refused, one more time, to actually be small when it mattered. The danger wasn't fully over. Feld's case, Meridian's collapse, the full reach of who else had been paid to look away, all of it still had to unravel in daylight, in courtrooms, in front of people who would finally have to answer for it. But the immediate danger, the one that had come for her in the dark, was finished. "Got it," Elaine murmured to herself, an old habit, the same 2 words she used to say at the end of every mission that ended with everyone still breathing. Whitfield glanced at her, not understanding, and didn't ask. He didn't need to. The courtroom was full by 9 a.m. Word had spread the way it always did in a small city. A corrupt doctor, a hidden war hero, a foiled hit ordered from a hospital office. By the time the trial reached its second week, reporters filled the back rows and Ashford general staff took turns slipping out during breaks to watch. Elaine sat in the witness section in her dress uniform for the first time in 6 years, the fabric unfamiliar and strangely heavy across her shoulders, though she stood straighter in it than she had in any scrub top she'd worn since coming home. Feld sat at the defense table looking smaller with every session. The confident posture, the practiced jaw angle for the cameras, all of it had eroded under weeks of testimony, bank records, and a parade of witnesses who no longer had any reason to protect him. "Ms. Voss," the prosecutor said, when it was finally her turn, "can you walk the court through the night of March 14th? She did. Calmly, clearly, in the same clipped, unadorned cadence she used in a trauma bay, because that was the only way she knew how to tell it honestly. The gurney. The word that hit the room like a detonation. The 2 minutes that stood between Daniel Reyes living and dying while Dr. Feld hesitated over an X-ray order he didn't need. "And in your professional opinion," the prosecutor asked, "if you hadn't intervened when you did?" "He would have died in that trauma bay," Elaine said. "Not from the gunshot wound. From a collapsed lung nobody was treating." The defense attorney, a tired-looking man who'd clearly run out of good arguments weeks ago, rose for cross-examination. "Ms. Voss, isn't it true you acted outside your scope of practice that night?" "Yes," Elaine said without hesitation. "I did." The answer, so plainly given, seemed to catch him off guard. "You admit that?" "I acted outside my civilian scope of practice," she said. "I acted well within the scope of 9 years of combat medical training that Dr. Feld was aware existed the moment his own patient called me by name in front of a full trauma bay. He chose, in that moment, to prioritize his authority over that patient's life. I chose the opposite. I'd make the same choice again." The defense attorney had nothing to follow that with. He sat down. The colonel testified 2 days later, laying out Elaine's service record in full: the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the extraction under fire that had, 9 years earlier, saved the life of the very man Feld had nearly let die twice. The courtroom listened in a silence usually reserved for funerals, the weight of it settling differently over each person present. Agent Whitfield walked the jury through Meridian Clinical Partners line by line. The falsified consent forms, the missing equipment, the shell payments traced back to a security contractor with a documented history of resolving problems for clients who paid well enough. He laid out, with careful, procedural patience, how Feld had tipped off that contractor within an hour of Reyes' admission, identifying Elaine by name as the nurse who'd recognized his condition and, by extension, the threat she posed to everything Feld had built. By the trial's final week, even Halloran took the stand, testifying against the man he'd once shielded, describing budget requests he now understood he should have questioned years earlier. The verdict, when it came, took the jury less than 4 hours. Guilty. On every count: fraud, falsification of federal records, and conspiracy to commit murder for his role in the attack on Elaine's apartment. Feld's sentencing hearing was quieter than the trial had been, most of the reporters gone, most of the public interest already spent. He was given one final chance to speak before sentencing, and when he stood, his voice came out thin, stripped of every ounce of the authority he'd once wielded so easily in hospital hallways. "I built that trial program," he said, the same line he'd used the day security led him away, as if repetition could make it true. "I gave that hospital something it never had before." "You gave it a lie," the judge said, "funded by federal money and paid for, nearly, in a nurse's blood." He was sentenced to 18 years. Ashford General's board announced, the following month, that his medical license had been formally revoked, and that the hospital's trauma protocol, the real one, rebuilt from the ground up with actual federal oversight this time, would be named, at the unanimous vote of the nursing staff, the Voss Protocol. Elaine hadn't asked for that. She found out about it the same way everyone else did, from a memo taped to the break room bulletin board, and she stood in front of it for a long moment before Ruth Callahan, wheeling past with her 4-pole on the way to dialysis, paused beside her. "Told you," Ruth said, patting her arm, "you didn't have to hide forever." Elaine finally let herself smile. "No," she said. "I guess I didn't." Down the hall, in a hospital that finally had the equipment it had always been promised, a new trauma bay was being outfitted with the rapid infusers and portable ultrasound units that should have been there all along, tools that would save lives the way they were always meant to, instead of lining a dishonest man's pockets. The story wasn't over yet. There was one more thing left to do. 6 months later, Ashford General opened its new trauma and combat-adjacent medicine wing. It was smaller than the hospital's other departments, tucked at the end of a freshly painted hallway, but it had everything the old trial program had only ever pretended to. Real ultrasound unit, real rapid infusers, real training taught by real veterans, for civilian medical staff who wanted to understand the kind of injuries most ERs never saw twice. A small brass plaque hung beside the entrance, the Voss Center for Trauma Readiness. Elaine stood in front of it on opening day, out of uniform this time, dressed simply, her sleeves rolled up without a second thought for the first time in years. She didn't hide the scar above her eyebrow anymore. She didn't hide the tattoo on her forearm either. "Feels strange, having your name on a door," said a voice behind her. She turned. Daniel Reyes stood there, fully recovered, a faint new scar tracing where the chest tube had gone in, a cane in one hand that he mostly used out of habit now rather than necessity. "Feels strange being seen at all," Elaine admitted. "I spent 6 years making sure nobody looked twice." "For what it's worth," Reyes said, "I'm glad I said your name that night. Even half-conscious. Some part of me knew." "Some part of you nearly got us both killed," she said, "but there was no bite in it." "Some part of me got us both saved," he said. "Depends how you tell it." Ruth Callahan arrived not long after, no longer needing the 4-pole. Her treatment plan had changed for the better, something Elaine liked to think had a little to do with the department finally having the resources it should have had all along. Priya was there too, now enrolled in the center's first training cohort, taking notes on everything Elaine said with the fierce, hungry attention of someone who had found, unexpectedly, the kind of teacher she hadn't known to look for. "You don't walk like a nurse," Ruth said again, echoing herself from a year earlier, standing a little straighter now without the pole to lean on. "You walk like somebody who finally stopped hiding it." Elaine looked around the new wing. The equipment that worked, the staff being trained properly, the patient who'd nearly died because one man's greed outweighed his competence, now standing beside her instead of in a grave. None of it erased what had happened. It didn't erase the years of small, quiet invisibility, or the friend she'd lost overseas whose name she still whispered sometimes, alone, late at night. But it had, finally, given all of that a place to live that wasn't buried. 2 identities. 1 person. No longer split in half by fear. Here's the truth this story keeps coming back to. The people who save us are rarely the ones standing tallest in the room. Sometimes the quietest person beside you has already survived more than you'll ever know, and the moment they finally stop hiding it is the moment everything changes, not just for them, but for everyone standing close enough to witness it. Courage isn't loud. Most of the time, it's just someone finally refusing to disappear. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe to Silent Heroes so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment below. What part of Elaine's story hit you hardest? And stick around because the next story is already waiting.